Welcome. Thank you for joining us for another program from the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Antigone Ladd. I'm delighted to be your host for this program. Tonight we're going to take a fresh look at an aspect of the Battle of Gettysburg that is often overlooked. Authors Tom Ryan and Richard Schaus looked at the 11 days following the Battle of Gettysburg. And because each of the men has a background in military intelligence, they chose to research that area and see if there was any new information they could add to what happened after the battle. And indeed, they did find new information, and that is the purpose of their book, and that is the talk that we have tonight. Our speaker tonight is Rick Schaus, who is one of the two authors. Rick is a retired Army officer with a background in intelligence and a passion for history. Rick is going to tell us tonight how he and Tom Ryan put this book together and how they even chose the topic in the much-studied Battle of Gettysburg. So, Rick, I'm going to turn the program over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Tom Ryan and I met at Gettysburg during one of the seminars that the Park Service had. And we had both participated in the Gettysburg discussion group in military history online. And we knew each other before we met at one of the seminars. I think it was 2008. And Tom ended up working on a book, Spies, Scouts, and Secrets of the Gettysburg Campaign, which was very well received and very well written. And he would send myself and a few other folks, as he finished the chapters, he'd send us copies to take a look at and make any comments or provide any information, anything we thought he could use. So I really got to know him. And through our discussions and a couple of meetings that we had, we decided that we wanted to get together and co-author a book on some Gettysburg topic. This is all done between Delaware and West Virginia, and we didn't even meet face-to-face in the course of putting the book together. And just around that time, Kent Masterson Brown wrote Retreat from Gettysburg, which covered Lee's army during the retreat and looked at it from the aspect of General Lee, his troops, and the Confederate withdrawal, retreat back to the Potomac. And I don't know if it was Tom or myself, but we said, wait a minute. Has anybody looked at the Union perspective, at Meade's role? And since Tom had covered intelligence in his Spies, Scouts, and Secrets, he had touched on the retreat and Colonel Sharp's BMI, and these fit right in with the idea. In fact, Tom calls our book a sequel to his Spies, Scouts, and Secrets. So we said, well, why don't we take a look and see what we've got to work with from the Union perspective? Because we both noticed that most histories will spend a page or a paragraph or a very short chapter saying that the battle ended, Lee retreated, recrossed the Potomac, and then the war continued on in Virginia. We both looked at it. I went out to see what was available online, and it's incredible how much information, how many publications and works that you used to have to go to the library to get, which meant you had to go to the Library of Congress, you had to go to this library in this town, or this library in this town, or Carlisle, to the Army facilities up there. There is so much available online, so many old primary source accounts. And so I found that there's more than enough. In fact, our initial manuscript was well over 500 pages. Some of it, obviously, the publisher said, "What? That's a little too much," and they whittled it down and edited it. And so we didn't necessarily agree with everything that was not included, but we had plenty of it. And I did the majority of the research, and Tom is a better wordsmith and tells a very good story. We worked, and I found incredible amount of sources and information. I may use one sentence from a book or just one paragraph somewhere that identified it. We found some interesting situations about names of places which no longer exist. And there was one example that we went to the Hagerstown Historical Society trying to find out where Delaware Mills was. because some Union accounts, regimental accounts, talked about moving across it, a place called Delaware Mills. Well, it's Delamere Mills. And we found that out from the Historical Society. They said, oh, maybe you're talking about Delamere. And the soldiers, not knowing the name, they just heard somebody say Della something, sounded like Delaware. So, and we put the book together and back and forth and between the publisher. So we decided that this is a topic that had not been touched very well. And I think we filled in a gap in the history of, believe it or not, of the Gettysburg Campaign that had not really been looked at or studied in detail.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. What you're seeing now is the cover of the book. It's changed a little bit since the original cover, which I'm showing. It shows an art print from Edwin Forbes, which I thought when we started the idea, the concept of the book would be make the perfect cover art for the book. The book covers the period from July 4th through 14th. If we go into a little bit of the 3rd of July, it's just to help establish background. After the failed assault on the Federal line on 3 July, General Lee made the determination that he would no longer be able to maintain the offensive in Gettysburg. So he made the decision that his army would retreat and he would take the army back to the safety of Virginia after crossing the Potomac River. The interesting thing about this is you might wonder why I'm showing a slide of General Lee when the subject of the book is about the Federal pursuit of Lee's army after Gettysburg. One of the key points to understand what happened during this period is that General Lee maintained the initiative even in defeat, and General Meade, commanding the Union Army of the Potomac, literally reacted to Lee's actions throughout the entire period. So Lee maintained the initiative, and Meade would react to those moves, what General Lee was doing, which is why we show Lee here. Now, during the period, we have a difference between the two commanders, which is significant. General Lee operated independently. He had no guidance on the spot, no tactical supplemental from anybody in the Confederate government. His commander-in-chief was Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, who you see on the slide in front of you. They had discussed Lee's operation prior to initiating his invasion of the North, but as for any guidance or leadership during the course of that campaign, Lee would send information back to his superiors, President Davis specifically, but Davis had no active role in the campaign to include Lee's retreat and his move back across the river back into the safety of Virginia. On the other side of the line, General George Gordon Meade, commanding the Army of the Potomac, he was operating semi-independently because of the nearness of his leaders, his chain of commanders, operating out of Washington, D.C. So General Meade, in addition to commanding the army, which was facing Lee's army at Gettysburg for 3 days of the battle, General Meade, especially after the battle, when more and better communication were established, General Meade would get direction and guidance, not always wanted, from two gentlemen, specifically his military commander, General-in-Chief of the Armies, who was General Henry Halleck, who you see in front of you, nicknamed Old Brains, who ran the War Department and was Meade's immediate superior. Throughout the period, Halleck would provide his guidance, his advice, what he thought Meade should be doing, and he was not always playing in the same ball field. His guidance would vary. Sometimes he would be encouraging Meade to move faster. Other times he would tell Meade to take his time and to stop or to consolidate his forces. So Henry Halleck's guidance to General Meade could be more frustrating than helpful. Meade did not always appreciate Halleck's point of view, especially since it was coming to Washington, D.C. The other individual who attempted to and was very unsuccessful in providing guidance and leadership for General Meade was the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, who had not held any significant military position prior to becoming president, actually proved to be a very good strategic leader and not a bad tactician, although he didn't think he was, and would often rely too much on General Halleck, believing that Halleck was the military expert, and Lincoln felt that he was not. So while Lincoln did prove himself to be very good in leadership position and strategically and tactically, he didn't see it. He didn't see himself as providing that role. But one thing Lincoln did see was after the Battle of Gettysburg was that General Meade had a brilliant opportunity to take what had begun at Gettysburg and continue it, because Lee, once he began retreating, was not in the best condition. He had an army that had been defeated at Gettysburg in 3 days of very bloody fighting, and now Meade was retreating, and Meade had the opportunity to inflict, and this is in Lincoln's opinion, and a lot of others also, to inflict further damage on Lee's army, if not destroy the army in Northern Virginia. And by destroy, I do not mean defeat in combat and kill everyone or wound every soldier, but compelling Lee to be in a condition where he would have to surrender, as in being surrounded, not being able to break out, or if he were to have, say, a raging river at his back and not be able to cross it, which actually happened, that there was an opportunity for Meade to inflict further damage, if not cause significant damage, to Lee's already damaged army. So General Meade did not have the advantage that General Lee had of being an independent command. Now, when Lee made the determination to retreat, he called on his only available cavalry officer, whose brigade had not been heavily engaged, who would escort one of the many wagon trains that would comprise the retreat of the Army of Northern Virginia. That was General John M. Bowdoin, who commanded a basically irregular brigade of Confederate cavalry, which usually operated in Western Virginia and what was to become West Virginia. M. Bowdoin's brigade was tasked by Lee to provide the escort for the wagon train of Confederate wounded, those who were able to be moved, who could get back into Virginia, because these men who hopefully would recover could come back, many of them could come back to duty in the army, and they would continue to fight with Lee, because resources of Confederate manpower were badly depleted even at this time in the war. So General M. Bowdoin would escort the wagon train of wounded, primary wagon train of the wounded, and that wagon train would turn out to be 17 miles long. So he had a great responsibility. Lee provided a few pieces of artillery to accompany M. Bowdoin, but he was on his own to begin getting the wagon train, which would be the first to depart. And that wagon train would depart later on the 4th of July. And that would be the first train off. The weather on the 4th had turned rainy, the roads turned muddy, but the Confederate wounded in their wagon train with M. Bowdoin escorting did begin the long trip back to Virginia on the afternoon of the 4th of July. We go across the line, and this is Colonel George Sharp. He would provide General Meade with information, intelligence is what we call it today. It was called information back then. He would provide intelligence to General Meade of the operation of what Lee's army was doing. Colonel Sharp headed an organization known as the Bureau of Military Information, the BMI, which had come into being under General Hooker, who was Meade's predecessor. We would today call Sharp's operation all-source intelligence. Sharp's men, his organization, would gather intelligence from cavalry, from civilian informants, from his own scouts, and that included military personnel who would actually operate in Confederate uniforms or civilian uniforms and actually intermingle with Confederate troops to gather intelligence as to their intentions. Sharp's organization was extremely efficient, although General Meade, not being familiar with the BMI and how they operated, was often skeptical of what they provided information. The skepticism was primarily involved with the numbers of Confederate forces. General Hooker and General Meade after him all believed that Lee's army, certainly based on his fact that he invaded the North, was much larger than it actually was. At one point, Meade was told and believed that Lee's infantry alone consisted of 92,000 men, which was extremely an overestimate. But throughout the course of the campaign, Sharp would provide information on the whereabouts and the movements of Lee's army, which was an advantage that Lee did not have. He had no comparable organization. Now, on the 4th of July, General Meade opened a rift in strategy with the commander-in-chief, President Lincoln. You see the both of them here. Lincoln's belief in his orders to the commanders of the Army of Potomac, the latest one being General Meade, was that the primary objective of Meade's Army of the Potomac was the destruction of Lee's Army in Northern Virginia. That was his primary mission. Secondary mission was to continue to protect Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland, to keep the Confederates from moving on those two, even though Washington was significantly well-defended city. General Meade, on the other hand, would take the position that after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, his mission was to drive the Confederates off of our soil being the northern states of Pennsylvania and Maryland. That statement he made in his congratulatory letter to the Army of the Potomac after the battle, stating that their work was not yet finished, they needed to drive the invaders off our soil. Mr. Lincoln, recognizing that, in his opinion, all of the United States, whether it was the secession, the states that seceded, or the loyal states, it was all our soil. And General Meade's mission was to destroy the army in Northern Virginia, not to drive them back south of the river. And after reading Meade's congratulatory message, Mr. Lincoln was not happy and expressed that concern to General Halleck, who in turn passed it on to General Meade. So this rift between President and his general, army commander, would continue throughout those 11 days after the battle until Lee recrossed the Potomac and a decision would not be reached and President Lincoln's goal would not be met. When Lee decided to retreat, he would rely on his subordinate commanders to get his army safely back into Virginia. You see in front of you his senior corps commander, General James Longstreet. At Gettysburg, Longstreet had not been in favor of fighting there. He had opposed it, believing that he had an agreement with General Lee to fight a defensive battle and not an offensive battle. So Longstreet was not the happiest of campers during the battle, and he made his position known. And there's continuing arguments and discussions today of Longstreet's role in the battle, whether he was the scapegoat, the villain, or whether simply that he was not in the best of moods and did not perform adequately at Gettysburg. The next two corps commanders were brand new to corps command. Richard Ewell commanded the 2nd Corps of the Army, Northern Virginia. He also had not performed well at Gettysburg and certainly would not have met Lee's expectations. He had performed very well as a division commander. He had lost a leg and was back in the Gettysburg campaign, was his first campaign after recovering his health after the amputation of one of his legs. Ewell would be depended on to perform much better than he had at Gettysburg in keeping his corps in line and getting them back to the safety of Virginia. The 3rd Corps commander, a brand new commander like Ewell, was A.P. Hill, Ambrose Powell Hill. Hill also had not performed well at Gettysburg. Part of it had been he was not well. His health was such that he had not been able to effectively lead on the first day when one of his subordinate commanders had actually initiated the Confederate action on the first day. So Hill's performance at Gettysburg, similar to Ewell's, had not been up to the standards that Lee needed him to meet, especially since this was the first battle fought with a three-corps system. Since General Jackson was now dead, Lee had made a determination that he would no longer be able to operate with two almost independent operating Army Corps. He would have three, and they would not be able to act independently, and they would have to rely on each other. And that had not worked out very well at Gettysburg. And unfortunately, the test of battle was the only way Lee would find out how the system would work. Lee's Corps commander was General Jeb Stuart. Again, Stuart, similar to the other three Corps commanders commanding a division of cavalry, had not had a good battle at Gettysburg. He had been separated from the Army of Northern Virginia early on and had not been able to rejoin Lee's army until the second day of battle. And he had not been able to provide necessary intelligence and movements of the Union Army to General Lee, and Lee felt his absence very seriously and had on numerous occasions wondered where Stuart was until he did appear on the second day. And Stuart's division had not performed well at Gettysburg. He would need to perform much better during Lee's retreat. Unfortunately for General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, Stuart's troopers did a better than adequate job during those 11 days in covering Lee's retreat from prying eyes and raiding a Union cavalry. We cross the lines now, and finally, after intelligence gathering, making observations, information from other sources, General Meade made the final determination that Lee indeed was retreating. He was moving his army back towards the safety of Virginia. And somewhat belatedly, General Meade decided that he would have his largest and healthiest Army Corps, the 6th Corps, commanded by General John Sedgwick, who you see in front of you on the slide, that Sedgwick would command the corps that would follow, not necessarily pursue, follow Lee's army to make sure Lee's intentions were that he was actually retreating. So General Sedgwick would follow the retreat. His orders were not to engage. He was basically on a reconnaissance, roughly 13,000 man reconnaissance. And just to make sure Sedgwick didn't get any ideas to initiate combat, General Meade forbid General Sedgwick from taking his ammunition trains with him. So his men would only have the ammunition they carried with them if they got into some kind of a fight. So General Sedgwick began his movement to follow Lee's army. He also had General Warren, who was the chief engineer, operating with him. And between the two of them, they would follow Lee just to make sure that Lee was in fact retreating. So we get to the 5th of July, and Sedgwick has departed and beginning to follow. And on the 5th of July, General Meade had a visitor at his headquarters. General Herman Haupt commanded the military railroads in the east. So Haupt was a very good engineer, and he did an excellent job of keeping the railroads moving, keeping them operational, repairing damage, supplying the army. And Haupt made his way to Gettysburg on the 5th of July to converse with his old West Point classmate, General Meade, to see what Meade needed from the railroads, what Haupt would need to do to support Meade's army. On the 5th of July, General Haupt met with his old friend, General Meade, and during the course of his meeting, Haupt became concerned that Meade was not really making a significant effort to pursue Lee's army. Haupt felt that Lee had the capability, his engineers could build the bridge. Meade had found out on the day before that the pontoon bridge Lee had at Falling Waters was partially destroyed by Union cavalry. And he had also been informed, as had General Lee, that the Potomac River was now unfordable at Williamsport. It was unfordable everywhere, basically. And so, other than a ferry operating at Williamsport, General Lee was at the mercy of Mother Nature, who had interfered with his plans. And General Lee would now have to consider forming a defensive perimeter around Williamsport until the pontoon bridge was repaired and the Potomac receded enough so it could be forded at Williamsport. So this was an opportunity. It was unexpected, but General Help did not see a lot of confidence and a lot of an aggressive nature on the part of General Meade. So when General Help left that day, he made a beeline to go to Washington, D.C., and he spoke with General Halleck and President Lincoln and passed along his concerns about Meade's lack of initiative and lack of aggression, and that, of course, caused the president more concern, and he passed that on to General Halleck to make sure that Meade was doing everything he could to bring Lee to battle again before Lee would be able to cross the Potomac and back into the safety of Virginia, especially since the advantages were all in Meade's favor, with Lee's badly damaged army at Gettysburg kind of at Meade's mercy to some extent if he took advantage of it. As we move along in time to the next day, on the 6th of July, we had the Union Army starting to stir and units were beginning to move. Meade had a conference on the 4th of July, and the determination was made by his subordinates. They voted that they would pursue Lee on a parallel route, which meant that they would move around, keeping Washington between Lee, and they would be between that. So Meade would pursue, but he would have to pursue faster and over a greater distance, which certainly would not have improved General Help's viewpoint, and it didn't. The gentleman you see in front of you is the initial chief of staff during the battle, Daniel Butterfield, who had been chief of staff under General Hooker and would continue with the duties under General Meade, primarily because although Meade wanted someone he was more familiar with than Butterfield, the time between Meade taking command of the army and the Battle of Gettysburg did not allow for another officer to become familiar, as the duties of the chief of staff were significant. Butterfield had been chief of staff. He was chief of staff. He knew the operation of the army much better than Meade did, so Meade kept him on. Unfortunately for Butterfield, he was wounded by a shell fragment that hit him, did not pierce the skin. He was not seriously wounded superficially, but he was in pain from the shell fragment that hit him. It was about a 2-inch shell fragment, and he was unable to carry on with the duties of chief of staff, and he relented and left the army as chief of staff on the 6th of July. He would be replaced by General Gouverneur Warren, chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac, and General Alfred Pleasonton, who commanded the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac. So there was, although Meade had more trust in Pleasonton and Warren, they were less familiar with the operation of the headquarters, but they would act for just a few days as co-chiefs of staff of the Army of the Potomac. Now, as cavalry chief, Pleasonton's orders from Meade were for his cavalry to harass Lee's trains. Throughout the book, we talk about options available to Meade other than simply pursuing and engaging Lee's army at Williamsport. But Meade's orders to Pleasonton and Pleasonton's orders to his cavalry commanders were to harass Lee's trains. And that's how it began. On the 6th of July, those orders were somewhat amended to General John Buford, who you see in front of you. General Buford commanded the 1st Division of Union Cavalry. His troopers, 2 brigades of which had fought the initial delaying action against General Heath's, General Hill's troops on the first day. Unfortunately, Buford's troopers had been relieved and moved on to Taneytown to guard wagon trains of the Army of the Potomac, and he had not been available on most of the 2nd and all of the 3rd at Gettysburg. General Buford received orders on the 6th of July to engage, to take the town of Williamsport, which was the likely route that General Lee would take to cross the Potomac at Williamsport and Falling Waters. So Buford was ordered to take his 3 brigades, he had all 3 brigades at the time, and occupy Williamsport, which would be a significant blow to Lee's efforts to retreat. On the 6th of July later, Buford made the attempt and got into a fight with General Imboden's troopers and a catch-all force made up of a number of Confederate wounded who were able to take part in the defense of Williamsport. And based on that, Buford was unable to capture the town and was forced to withdraw. So Lee's army was safe to retreat using Williamsport as both a ford and the ferry, which was the only way that Lee was able to initially get his army across the river, which continued on the 7th and the 8th and the 9th of July. Lee, in addition to having thousands of wounded, he still had a number of supplies. He had all of his infantry, all of his artillery, and his cavalry to get across the river. In addition to those, he had up to 5,000 Union prisoners of war who did not accept parole, which was no longer legal, but it was attempted to parole them by the Confederates. Some Union troops did accept parole, but about 5,000 were under guard and had to cross and move with the Confederate Army heading south to what would be imprisonment in prison camps in Richmond and other areas in the South. So Lee had quite a large army and additional personnel to get across the river to safety. This is the actual painting, the watercolor done by Edwin Forbes of the retreat of Lee's army. What it looked like, it gives you a good idea of how the weather was through most of the time of these 11 days. There was a lot of rain, especially initially from the 4th of July on, when the weather was not good. When the weather did finally clear, it became very hot and humid, which was almost as bad for the troops on both sides to move in. So this is what basically you were going to see as the Union Army moved in parallel to Lee's army, hoping at some point to encounter him probably around Hagerstown or Williamsport, which were the vicinities that it looked like Lee's army was withdrawing, retreating to. On the 7th of July, President Lincoln made a statement at a gathering. He spoke to a crowd that had gathered outside the White House, and he gave his expectations as Commander-in-Chief of what General Meade would do. He said, "Now, if General Meade can complete his work so gloriously prosecuted thus far, by the literal or substantial destruction of Lee's army, the rebellion will be over." Now, this, of course, as I said, differed with General Meade's opinion that his responsibility, that what he wanted to do was to drive Lee's army out of the North. So there, again, this difference came to light on the 7th based on President Lincoln's statement. Meade himself had made a number of statements, including to his wife, who was his chief confidant, in letters that he wished to have another engagement, that he would rather fight Lee in Maryland than in Virginia, which was kind of an obvious conclusion. It was shared by his subordinate commanders and the rank and file of the Army of Potomac. So, but his plan was to just simply escort Lee's army out of the North and across the river, which was not in line with the president's expectations. This is General Andrew Atkinson Humphreys. He would become the chief of staff of the Army of the Potomac, and he would replace General Warren and General Pleasanton. Meade had wanted Humphreys in that role of chief of staff. Humphreys did not want it. He was more of a combat commander. He had commanded a division in Sickles' 3rd Corps at Gettysburg. He preferred command of a division than the staff duties of chief of staff. but finally Meade convinced him to take the job. And on the 8th of July and throughout the 11 days that the book is about, General Humphreys would continue and would effectively act as chief of staff for the Army of the Potomac. On the 9th of July, the Army in Northern Virginia, Lee's army, began taking position, the infantry around the city of Hagerstown. The trains continued to move on to Williamsport, waiting for the completion of the bridge. Lee's engineers were indeed working on restoring the pontoon bridge. Some of the pontoons had been recovered. They would use lumber and other equipment from the town of Williamsport, float them downriver to Falling Waters, where the bridge hopefully would be completed sooner rather than later. During the course of the battle and afterwards, General Meade needed to replace 3 corps commanders from Gettysburg who had either been killed or wounded and were no longer able to function in the role of corps commanders. The 3 officers who Meade selected, he actually had the carte blanche ability to select whoever he wanted to replace any commander he wanted to replace. These are the 3 officers that Meade chose to replace officers who had been killed or wounded. The first one he replaced here, he would appoint, was General John Newton, who replaced General John Reynolds, who was killed in action on the 1st of July. Newton was a division commander in the 6th Corps. Not a stellar record. He was not an aggressive, certainly not a Reynolds type of officer. He was an engineer, which was what Meade was, so there was probably some familiarity. But General Newton was selected by Meade to command the 1st Corps. 1st Corps didn't know him. He didn't know the 1st Corps, which never helps the situation. The second officer was General William Hayes, who was basically an unknown general officer of the Gettysburg Campaign. He arrived at the Army of the Potomac in some unknown duty function somewhere around the 3rd of July, maybe the 2nd, and on the 3rd of July was selected by General Meade to replace Winfield Scott Hancock, who was wounded in action on the 3rd of July. Hancock's reputation at Gettysburg is known to everybody and very favorable. He was assumed a leadership position on all 3 days, being selected by Meade to ride to Gettysburg and make the determination whether that was where the battle would be fought. Hancock's reputation was well known, and William Hayes, who had earlier been captured by Confederates and paroled later or replacement by a Confederate who was released by the Union side. Hayes didn't last long in the position. He was a very lackluster officer, not anybody who would be compared anyway to General Hancock. But he would command the 2nd Corps during Meade's pursuit. The 3rd officer was General William French. He had been in the Army of the Potomac. He was actually in command of the garrison at Frederick, Maryland, and Meade called him to assume command of the 3rd Corps later on, probably around the 8th or the 9th of July. He replaced Sickles, who was wounded in action, lost a leg on the 2nd of July. Now, Sickles was a very controversial officer before and at Gettysburg, but he was very well respected by his corps and was an aggressive officer for having no significant military background. General French was, again, a very lackluster officer, and none of the 3 officers would be in a command position at the beginning of 1864 for the Overland Campaign under command of the new general of the armies, General Grant. So Meade's choice of officers seemed to reflect his caution, being a very cautious and very defensive-oriented officer who had seen the defense work and the offense of Lee not work at Gettysburg. So these 3 officers were, and nobody to write home about, but they would not make any unexpected aggressive movements which might get Meade into trouble, which he did not want to get into. He was acting cautiously, and they would ensure that he would continue to act cautiously. One of the advantages that Meade had, he had sent down to the Army of the Potomac a pontoon train, which is depicted here, you can see on the slide, is a pontoon train. And Meade had the ability to lay a pontoon bridge wherever he wanted it erected. Wherever he wanted the bridge, whatever his plan would be, to ford the river and surround or cut off Lee's escape route, which was certainly possible. Meade had the pontoon train available. And I'll show you a close-up of the wagons with the individual pontoons on them. The pontoons would be lowered into the water, drop down, they would be floated and anchored into the position, then planking would be put over there, and troops would march, artillery wagons could cross on the pontoon bridge. Unfortunately, during the period of the 11 crucial days, fateful days, between the 4th and the 14th, Meade did not have this pontoon bridge laid, so he would be able to cross cavalry, infantry, whatever, to upset Lee's plans to retreat back across the Potomac. That didn't happen. But Meade did have the pontoon bridge available. All he had to do was tell his engineers where he wanted it. This is another Forbes painting, watercolor, of his version of what they saw in the defenses, Confederate defenses around Williamsport. Lee was forced to assume a defensive perimeter until the Potomac receded, until he was able to have the bridge completed, the pontoon bridge, and meanwhile the ferry boat kept working. So Lee would have to establish a defensive position. Lee established a roughly 10-mile long defensive perimeter, which was much longer than what Meade had in his interior lines at Gettysburg, and Lee would have to man this 10-mile long perimeter with approximately a little less than 40,000 troops. So it was a tall effort, and certainly this 10-mile long line, which was kind of put together, it was not a solid line. Some places were stronger than others. Some were not very well defended, and certainly the manpower wasn't there to establish a significant line. But Lee's engineers outlined this position. Colonel Alexander, E.P. Alexander, who wrote a number of very excellent accounts of his time in the Army of Northern Virginia, he was part of that group that developed the defensive line. He said it was kind of a put-together line, hodgepodge, patched together of the best available positions. And some places, like I said, were fairly substantial and well defended. Other points weren't, and none of it was well manned. Now, while Lee was digging in and developing his perimeter, General Meade would do the same thing. But one of Meade's other concerns was to see exactly what Lee was doing. So this slide depicts a signal officer up in the attic of probably a home in the vicinity of Williamsport, using a telescope to observe the Confederate position. They would obviously provide information on the defensive positions, where they were, how strongly they could see they were defended. The weather, being as bad as it was, didn't always help, and information was not always easily accessible to those prying eyes that were trying to figure out what exactly Lee was doing. But Lee had developed his line at around Hagerstown until approximately on the 10th or early on the 11th, when he began moving his troops into perimeter, the defensive perimeter established around Williamsport. So what Lee had effectively done was had given me the opinion that he was that he was building a defensive area somewhere around Hagerstown. It was somewhat of a deceptive move on Lee's part. But he eventually, once the defensive line was outlined and laid out, Lee would begin moving his infantry into the defensive line and further entrench and build up his defensive line until he could actually begin to move his army across the Potomac. Meanwhile, back in Washington, President Lincoln was certainly still concerned about the slow movement of Meade's army in pursuit of Lee, and the fact that Lee was already in the Hagerstown-Williamsport area, and reports had that he was crossing his personnel, if just slowly. So President Lincoln was very concerned that Lee would in fact escape. The president is shown here with his two secretaries, John Nicolay, who was on our left, on the president's right, and John Hay, the junior secretary, who was on to the right or to the president's left. Now, Hay at this time maintained a diary, and his entry for the 11th of July stated that Washington had been informed by General Meade that he would attack on the following day, the 12th. John Hay, in his opinion, did not think that attack would take place. And as it turns out, he was correct, because despite what Meade told Washington, Meade did not make an attack on Lee's lines on the 12th. Instead, there was some movement. Lee was awaiting an attack. He expected an attack, especially since by the 10th and the 11th, and definitely by the 12th, Meade had his army in position surrounding Lee's army, and Meade had in fact also dug in. Meade's defensive position might have actually surpassed Lee's, although we really don't know anything about the entrenchments that Meade had dug, although unit accounts, regimental accounts, talk about the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac doing a lot of digging and establishing defensive positions. On this slide of General Meade, you can see that he has his spectacles protruding from about the middle of his coat. Meade wore spectacles, probably part of the reason he was known as Old Google Eyes. On the 12th, when he was supposed to be attacking Lee's army, General Meade had a little time to write a letter to his wife. The letter he wrote on the 12th is not included in either volume, second volume, primarily, of the Life and Letters of George Gordon Meade, written by his son and grandson, and edited by his son and grandson. But in the letter, which is in Meade's files, in his papers, he complained to his wife, while this immense episode in American history was possible, that there might be a battle that might defeat Lee was possible, and Meade began the letter by making a reference to the situation, but he went on to tell his wife he was complaining that he had ordered spectacles and had been sent eyeglasses by mistake, which is somewhat interesting in that when this event in American history could be taking place, General Meade is complaining about receiving eyeglasses instead of the spectacles that he had ordered. It's kind of an interesting move on Meade's part, that maybe he wasn't overly concerned with what he had said was going to happen on the 12th. This is a view, a pencil, of the retreat of Lee's position at Williamsport, and you can see the river crossing to some extent. This was probably while he was making his main effort, and after the Potomac had receded, which had happened on the 12th, and the bridge would turn out to be available for crossing at Falling Waters on the 13th. Another view of the retreat is shown here. It shows troops fording, cavalry fording the river, and in the distance, I'll close it in for you here, you can see the ferry. Now, for most of the time that Lee was at Williamsport, this little ferry that carried just a few wagons or troops across, it was General Lee's sole means of getting across the Potomac until the river receded on the 12th and the pontoon bridge was completed on the 13th. So you can see, based on that to move an entire army and supplies and Union POWs, there was a significant effort was going to have to take place once the bridge was completed and the river was able to be forded. So that gives you an idea of what Lee had available for most of those 11 days. Finally, after calling a council of war on the evening of the 12th, after he did not attack, when Meade was actually expecting to be attacked, he notified his army of that possibility on the 12th. He called a council of war on the evening of the 12th. And in a very interesting council, Meade was able to convince his subordinate commanders to vote against making the attack that Meade had informed General Halleck again for the second day in a row. He told General Halleck that he would attack on the 13th if nothing interfered, if nothing caused him difficulty. But During the course of the Council of War, Meade, who had said himself that he wanted to attack, but he could not make such a momentous decision without his corps commanders providing guidance to him, he convinced his corps commanders that they should not attack, as he had told Halleck he would do. And instead, Meade made a determination that he would conduct a personal reconnaissance on the 13th and find out more information, because he was lacking actual intelligence on what Lee was doing, what his line looked like, before Meade would make an actual attack. So on the 13th, unfortunately, Meade couldn't see much making his personal reconnaissance. So the evening of the 13th, Meade sent out a circular instructing that 4 divisions of the Army would conduct a reconnaissance in force the following morning at 7 a.m. 4 divisions from 4 of the Corps, the 2nd Corps, the 5th Corps, the 6th Corps, and the 12th Corps, would advance to a position where they could see the Confederate line and report back on what they observed. This was not an attack. This was a reconnaissance force with the sole mission of taking a look at the Confederate defenses to see if there was some position where Lee could successfully be attacked, where Meade would have a reasonable expectance of success. There was no overall commander of this reconnaissance. It was simply 4 divisions moving forward to get a look at the Confederate line. Well, that morning came, and it was just enough time, the evening of the 13th and on the morning of the 14th, for Lee to get his army into position, for cavalry to relieve the infantry, so no impression of a retreat would be seen by the Union forces. Cavalry moved into the infantry positions. The infantry moved back, and Lee took his army across the Potomac via the ford at Williamsport and the pontoon bridge at Falling Waters. At 7 o'clock, 4 divisions moved forward, and what they discovered was not entrenched and manned positions of the Army of Northern Virginia. What they saw were empty defensive positions. So they continued on, reported back that the Army of Northern Virginia was not there. They had gone. The Confederates were no longer there. Meade ordered an immediate pursuit, and in front of you on the slide that you can see is a depiction of the fight at Falling Waters between Union cavalry and the Confederate rear guard. These are troopers from Custer's Michigan Brigade who were very badly handled by the Confederate rear guard. The 6th Michigan suffered significant casualties, and their primary achievement was to mortally wound General Pettigrew, who was in command of the rear guard. Unfortunately for the rear guard, which turned out to be Pettigrew's infantry, his infantry was supposed to be relieved by Confederate cavalry to complete their screening, but the cavalry went ahead and crossed the river, leaving the infantry to be surprised and not relieved, and so they bore the brunt of the Union assault, which was unsuccessful, and the cavalry managed to capture a couple of wagons and some stragglers. So the time allowed for Lee to get his army across was granted by General Meade, and Lee had his army safely into what was West Virginia, what would be shortly thereafter, back into Virginia and the safety of friendly Southern territory, familiar territory of Virginia. So Lee had successfully escaped from General Meade and the possibility of another engagement somewhere north of the Potomac. Needless to say, President Lincoln was very disappointed. On the 14th, the day that Lee crossed, President Lincoln wrote a letter to General Meade expressing his disappointment. He thought about this letter, took advantage of time to consider what had happened and what hadn't happened, put the letter in an envelope and said, "Letter to General Meade not sent," and never sent it. Although certainly history has discovered that letter and we know what was in it, that President Lincoln was extremely disappointed and expressed that disappointment many times in the future. Nothing happened of expectation of the great anticipation that the Battle of Gettysburg would lead to Lee's defeat. Nothing happened during the rest of 1863 in that theater. It wasn't until President Lincoln brought a new commander to the east from the fighting around Vicksburg and the Western Theater, and General Grant was given a 3rd star and made General-in-Chief of the armies. And General Grant would spend most of his time flying his headquarters flag where General Meade and the Army of the Potomac were. Grant recognized that the significant theater of the war in terms of politics would be against General Lee. So it wasn't until the Overland Campaign began in 1864 that General Grant would lead the final, what took a significant amount of time yet, effort to defeat General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. This is the equestrian statue of General Meade at Gettysburg. Meade's legacy between Gettysburg and Lee's successful escape with his army basically intact is a very divided and very uncertain legacy. His army fought a defensive battle and beat Robert E. Lee. That hadn't happened before, and it really wouldn't happen again in a significant engagement. But his failure to bring Lee to battle again before Lee recrossed the river certainly tarnished Meade's reputation, and he has certainly become, to some extent, an unknown general, even though he commanded a victorious army at Gettysburg. So his legacy is divided. He's often not known his actual role in the battle because it was defensive, and he had subordinate officers that are more well known than Meade was when you talk about the Battle of Gettysburg. In fact, many of the Confederates are more well known than General Meade was. And usually every year you see a magazine article or two about General Meade's legacy and the unknown officer whose army, who was in command at Gettysburg, but who failed to follow up on that to bring Lee's army to more serious destruction. Again, we have the cover of the book. And in closing, I would like to share an anecdote with you from President Lincoln. One of the things that I admire about the president at the time was that despite all the horror and the certain destruction and the secession of the Confederacy, and probably the worst time in American history was the time of the Civil War, when Lincoln had to lead the country through some of the worst days in our history, he maintained a sense of humor. And I think that helped him along. It certainly helped those around him to get extra anticipation that somehow success would take place. And an example of President Lincoln's humor was expressed after the battle. And not long after the Battle of Gettysburg, Meade went to Washington, D.C. to have conferences and to meet with the leadership there to determine the conduct of the war. And not long after the battle, that was of Gettysburg, Lincoln met with Meade in Washington. "Do you know, General," Mr. Lincoln suddenly broke out with a laugh, "what your attitude towards Lee for a week after the Battle of Gettysburg reminded me of?" "No, Mr. President, what is it?" asked Meade. "I could think of nothing else," said Lincoln, "than an old lady trying to shoo her geese across the creek." Thank you very much.